Well, happy birthday to me, I guess. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody. So, as you may know, it is my birthday today, and I asked you guys what you want as a birthday present from me, because, I'm a hobbit at heart. Maybe. Who knows? And you made some suggestions, and I looked at all of them, and I've settled on one of them, and that's the video you're getting today. It's not really a list, but it will contain books, so good, I think. So that's basically Chadia's suggestion of listing books that have, impacted me as a person and as a reader, and I thought about that, and I think it's a really good sort of thing to talk about and think about, the kind of books that have shaped me as a person. Those may not necessarily be my favorite books, because I'm really bad at picking favorites, but these are books that, when I look at my life, that have certainly had an impact on the person I am, my way of interacting with books, my way of interacting with the world, and probably also shaped my tastes in books in one way or another. And I think, questioning ourselves in that regard is a clever thing. And one thing I noticed, and you'll notice when we go through all of these books, they're all basically by white men. And most of them dead by now. And that's also not necessarily good, but it's important to understand that my reading habits and my reading taste has certainly been very much shaped by old white men in a lot of ways. And while I'm trying to change that, I feel like the first part is just to be aware of it and take that into account. And a lot of these books are books that I've struggled with over the years, but I feel like the struggle has also had an impact. So, with all of that out of the way, let's go through some books that have shaped me as a reader. And I'll try to roughly go through those in, chronological order, in when I encountered them and what kind of impact they had on me. So let's start. And to no one's surprise, the first book on this list is, of course, Winnie the Pooh by A.A. Milne. I've spoken about this book before. It is certainly one of my favorite books. I always claim it's the perfect novel, the best book that ever written, and so forth. This may be slight hyperbole, but I encountered this first as a relatively small child, with a German version that I think was from when my mother was a kid, and I read that, and then I read a newer version in a reprint with different illustrations and so forth in German, and it was the first book that I read, actively sought out to read in English at a relatively young age. I think I might have been 10-ish or so when I read that in English. I still own that copy, physical copy of Winnie the Pooh with the original illustrations, and it has, I go back to that book at least once per year, and it has certainly shaped a lot of my personality in a lot of ways, in my love for really dumb wordplay and stuff like that. That's something that's in that book. My general sort of understanding of being a good person in a lot of ways. There's some really deep moral stuff going on in the Winnie the Pooh books compared to the movie, which I also like. The old movie with the wonderful Heffalump and Woozle part is just incredibly psychedelic, and I like that. So yeah, Winnie the Pooh is certainly one of the books that has turned me into the person that I am today. And I think, compared to some of the other books on this list, that's a good one, I feel. So let's move on to the next thing that I feel has had a huge impact on me as a person, reader, and explains a lot about myself. And that second book in that list will be Herodotus, The Histories. Now, if you don't know what that is, I forgive you. So Herodotus, a Greek historiographer, wrote roughly, before the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides, so in the 450s BCE. And the main part about his histories is, of course, the conflict between the Persian Empire and the Greek city-states. If you've, ever heard about, say, those 300 Spartans and so forth, that's one of the main sources of that story is, Herodotus' Histories. And I read that as a kid. I don't even remember why I wanted to read that, but I got myself the Reklam version. Now, if you are German, you probably know what that means. They are basically a bit like, Penguin Classics, something like that. They are usually what students buy when they have to buy classics. They're incredibly cheap. They're really small print, incredibly thin paper, yellow booklets, basically. And I got that version of Herodotus Histories, and I loved it, and I've read it since multiple times. Obviously, for when I was studying history, but also in between. And I think it's a valuable book in that it does showcase some basic understandings of how to do history compared to, say, Thucydides. Herodotus actually usually mentions his source and goes like, well, I've heard this thing, and the priest in this town told me this specific thing. And sometimes he gives like 2 or 3 different versions, goes like, well, I heard these 3 versions. I don't know what's correct, but you can make up your own mind on this. So really interesting in that regard. Also, by being a historiography, it's also very much a geography and ethnography, and it is just full of like really cool bits and pieces and myths and stuff. It has the gold digging ants in India, and the story of the phoenix is in there because it's this big jumbled mess of stuff, and I really, really enjoyed it, both for like what it does, and I've certainly read a lot of like secondary literature on the book as well, and there's some really interesting things in the way Herodotus wrote these histories, and I come back to it sometimes just for inspiration that I can use in, say, like role-playing games or whatever, because there's just so many cool bits and pieces in there, but it's also something where you can learn a lot about like how to structure a history and how to create history in a lot of ways. So yeah, and I read that, as I said, as a 10, 11-year-old kid, for whatever reasons. As I said, it explains kind of what kind of person I am in a lot of ways. So that's something that I feel has certainly shaped me as a person, with my love for history and reading history and historiography and reading history about history and so forth. And that's something I do to this day, and certainly had a huge impact on me. Let's move on to the next book that really shaped me. And yes, of course, Lord of the Rings is in there as well. But since I've spoken so much about Lord of the Rings, I don't necessarily think there's much more to add. But of course, Lord of the Rings did also shape me as a person. And I read all of it, read The Hobbit, read Lord of the Rings, read The Silmarillion. I was probably around 14-ish, I think. But yeah, so Lord of the Rings is in there, but not much more to say about this. But the next book that I think really shaped me as a person, for better or worse, is, of course, Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard. Well, that's not exactly a book. It's a number of short stories. I first read them online on, Project Gutenberg, where they are, because they are, out of the copyright. And then later I got myself the Del Rey 3-volume collection. If you can get that, that's, I think, is to this day the best Conan of Cimmeria collection. They have all the stories in publication order. Basically, they have some drafts and stuff and introductions. It's really good. And yes, Conan the Barbarian shaped me. I was probably like 15, 16, which is definitely the wrong time to read Conan, but also the only time people start reading Conan, I think. And it spoke to me back then when I was, an angry, edgy teenager, and later on it spoke to me in different ways, and it still does. And it's a series that I come back to again and again, and each time I reread Conan stories, I take something different out of it. And that's why I said, like, for better or for worse, because you can read Conan and take some very bad lessons from those books. They are, well, written by what I would call basically an incel before we had that term. Robert E. Howard, famously haunted person with a lot of personal issues, psychological issues, mental health struggles, that ended obviously with him taking his own life. And you can feel that anger, that anguish, and that uncertainty, that insecurity. That's something that drips off the page in those Conan stories. And that's why they obviously spoke to me when I was, 15 or 16. And later on I reread them and I realized, I was probably a bit more mentally better, I guess. And I realized how much insecurity is in there, and how it sort of like, how Conan is not exactly the kind of role model you want to have. And I realized that. And then a couple of years later, I reread the books and I realized a lot of the underlying racism in those stories that maybe I kind of ignored or glanced over when I read them for the first time. And then I reread them later again, and I noticed some other elements that are, more about self-taught philosophers, basically, in a lot of ways, because Robert E. Howard famously read a lot of like philosophy and other stuff, including Marx and Nietzsche. And it's easy if you just like select what kind of books you're reading. It's easy to feel erudite without actually having a larger understanding, and you can see that in those Conan stories again. And so, like, as I said, like, Conan has certainly shaped my life in a lot of ways. I am very critical of these stories, but I cannot understate sort of like the emotional impact those stories still have on me. And that's one of the reasons why I think Conan, all of the Conan stories by Robert E. Howard are, that thing. I've read most of his other stuff as well, and some of it I like, some of it I don't necessarily like as much, but like I feel like Conan is still like the main thing there. So that's the next book that shaped me. Now, for a jarring shift in tone, let's move to the next book that I think has shaped my understanding and my approach to a lot of things. And that is David Hume, An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. It's one of the first things I had to read, or at least an excerpt for philosophy when I studied philosophy at university. Later on, I was a tutor for like first year students in philosophy, and we had to go through the same text again. And I've read it numerous times, and I think it's I would argue one of the sort of like best written classic philosophy texts in a lot of ways. Like, it's from 1748, I think, roughly around that era. It is a classic sort of Scottish Enlightenment piece of philosophy, a lot of epistemology in there, and like a lot of stuff that Hume goes through. But the way he writes is incredibly clear. It's incredibly clear, but still very, very, very forceful. And I think it was like one of the first times I read that type of like classic philosophy and was able to understand not only what Hume is trying to say, but also understand how he is explaining things and how he's trying to say things. And in a lot of ways, like, studying philosophy is very much about like reading a lot of stuff throughout the ages and sort of like tracing ideas and understanding ways of thinking and so forth. It's not so much, I mean, obviously it's also about understanding specific texts, but it's very much about understanding and questioning the language and questioning how ideas are written down and portrayed and so forth. And in that regard, I feel that David Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding is just hands down one of the best written pieces of classic philosophy. And if you ever want to read, like, not contemporary philosophy that is written right now, but like want to read a classic, I feel it's probably one of the easiest to get into because it is so clearly written. It tackles so many ideas about like how we perceive the world, what we can say about the world, what we can't say about the world. Yeah, it's classic, and it has definitely impacted my understanding of philosophy, my approach to reading, my approach to talking about stuff. So yeah, that's David Hume in that regard. The next book that I think has massively shaped me as a person is Herman Melville's Moby Dick. Now, why is that, you may ask? So here's the thing, right? I read Moby Dick as a kid in a German translated and abridged version for children. Now, if you've read the actual book, you may be surprised that this is marketed to children as a children's adventure book, which, yeah, they're sailing on the ocean, but there's so much more to it. And when I started going to university, I decided to read that book again, and this time read it in English. So it was one of the first sort of like classics that I read in like the English original, and I was not necessarily prepared for it, but I kind of grew my understanding of the English language grew massively with reading Moby Dick, and my appreciation of the book like absolutely grew, and like the way Melville uses different styles throughout the book, like the way he builds up metaphors and similes, and it's just like it was really interesting to me because I think it was probably one of the first times I read fiction. I read a piece of literature, and outside of class, outside of anything else, and by myself went through the whole text like very analytically and going like, wow, I understand what he's doing there. And I think that's sort of like the two things that Moby Dick kind of gave me, is that approach to reading and looking at a text in that analytical way, just as something I want to do, that I apparently like to do, or at least do. And also it gave me the confidence to read more texts in English. Funny thing, the next book I read after that was, for whatever reason, Against the Day by Thomas Pynchon, and that was like a whole other level of like not being prepared to understand the English language. And yeah, I've been a Pynchon fan ever since, so it kind of worked again. Seems that that Terry Pratchett quote of always give children books that are meant for children 2 years older than they are at that point works for me as well. Like, I like to challenge myself, and those were sort of like the points that kind of help with that. So that is the next book. Now, what did I read after that? Yeah, I think it's time to talk about Terry Pratchett. So yeah, I started reading Discworld relatively late, by which I mean, it's probably 20, maybe 21, and I really fell in love with it from the first book on. Like, I read them in publication order. I started with Color of Magic, and at that time I was playing role-playing games. I had read Conan already. I had read Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, and I started reading Color of Magic, and yeah, I was hooked from the first book onwards, and it just like got better and better and better. And the more I kind of grew with those books and could see Terry Pratchett's world growing together with Terry Pratchett as a writer, and yeah, it's still one of my favorite series of all times. And I think it gave me a lot of things. It played on my love for, wordplay and just like love of like using a language creatively, and Pratchett clearly does that, of course. But it also showed me that it's very important to have a moral backbone, to have integrity, and have that infuse writing. Now, obviously, morals infuse all writing, but with Pratchett, it's very, very clear what he has to say and what he tries to say. And doing that and using fantasy to say something about the world right now and have clear moral stances is something that I've taken from Discworld and kept with me. And of course, the humor, because I really like Terry Pratchett's humor, and the fact that there's so much packed into that. I think that's what Discworld gave me in that regard. All right, so what else has shaped me as a person? Well, the next one is another sort of like weird, jarring shift of tone, and that is Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Yes, I've read the entire fucking thing, and yeah, I learned a lot. Both about like how to write history, also how to insult people in footnotes creatively, which is, Edward Gibbon is the master of like throwing shade in footnotes. Like, if you ever, and I don't necessarily recommend reading the whole thing unless you really want to. It's insanely long. The audiobook is like 126 hours. That's longer than the Bible. So there you go. No, it's a really, really important book in what it does historically, but also the way it shapes history. See, if Herodotus just goes out and writes about everything that fascinates him in the world, Edward Gibbon has a clear thesis of like why the Roman Empire fell, and he uses a lot of time and paper to explain that, and his history is very clearly focused on that. And I think that's one thing that I learned from it, is to read history not so much as a list of stuff that happened, but as someone explaining why they think something happened and what we should learn from that. And that I think is a key thing that I've learned. Obviously, once you study history, and I read that before I studied history at university, when you study history at university, that's one thing you learn, is like to understand that history is, of course, historiography is always written with an agenda. And that's one thing I learned from Edward Gibbon. Also, like, the sheer level of like prose skill that Gibbon brings to the table is insane. And the book about early Christianity is about as brutal when it comes to Christianity as you could get in the 18th century, and I highly recommend reading that. If you want to read just a bit of Edward Gibbon, read the parts about early Christianity and early Christian heresies. It's incredibly funny and informative and like just like brilliant. So that's another book that like really shaped me as a person, for better or worse, I guess. So what else is on that list? Well, I guess it's time to mention David Graeber and David Wengrow. I'm talking about The Dawn of Everything. Now, I had read something like Guns, Germs and Steel before, and I did not really vibe with it. And then I read David Graeber and David Wengrow's The Dawn of Everything, and yeah, then I understood why I didn't like Guns, Germs and Steel, and I really enjoyed that book. And then I read all kinds of other stuff by David Graeber, and I highly recommend reading some David Graeber. I just put this one in because it's the first one that I read. And yeah, it has shaped my understanding of looking at the world. The fact that the story that is basically mainstream history, so an understanding of human history is, well, shaped by ideology, of course, and that it is important to bring counter narratives just so we open up like the intellectual space so we can think about possibilities and so forth. And that's something that I appreciate in everything that Graeber did, and The Dawn of Everything just does this really well. Plus, it's just like really cool stories in there. It's really interesting, and I think that's one of the books, one of the more recent books that has sort of like shaped my understanding of the world. Graeber in general has very much shaped my understanding and the way I do things, the way I think about things, the way I feel about things in a lot of ways. I hesitate to put labels on myself, but there's a lot of anarchism in my understanding of the world, and I'm saying that as someone who has read all of Capital, which is not on this list because while I've read it, it's not necessarily something that has changed much of me as a person. I think to bring that slowly to an end, there are, one or two other books. One of them is Fredric Jameson's Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. That's a book that I read 2 years ago, I think. It's obviously a classic at this point, and I think what Jameson helped me to understand is to do, well, philosophy, serious philosophy, political philosophy, and take science fiction and fantasy and genre fiction generally seriously. Jameson wrote a lot of essays on science fiction books. He has another collection of essays, which is the Desire Called Utopia, and other science fictions, which is a lot about different science fiction texts. Postmodernism, or The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, starts with him talking about Neuromancer by William Gibson, and the fact that it is possible to do serious political philosophy on the subject of genre fiction is something that I feel like I was already, trying to do something like that with my YouTube videos. And when I read Jameson, I felt understood, or like justified, and go like, well, this makes sense. And in this regard, I feel like Jameson has given me a lot of confidence, or gave me back some confidence to talk about academic topics in these videos, and maybe mention some more like philosophy and stuff like that in these videos from time to time. And I think that is something that Jameson brought to the table, I think, and helped me turn into the person that I am. And I think that's maybe more or less it. I would argue that probably something that also is currently shaping my views is definitely Orientalism by Edward Said. I read that 3 years ago, and yeah, it's an important text, and everyone should read it at least once to understand what Orientalism actually means, and maybe sometimes check ourselves when we engage in it, which most of us here in the West do from time to time. And then, of course, earlier this year, I read a lot of Audre Lorde, and that also has shaped me. Here, one woman on this list. Isn't this amazing? Now, Audre Lorde, certainly someone I don't necessarily agree with all her takes, but there's just like a level of like intensity in her writing that really moves me, and that really, hopefully helps me reflect more on how I interact with other people, with women, with people of color, and so forth. And hopefully it does have a large impact on me. Right now, I would say yes. Ask me again in like 5 years and we'll find out, I guess. Anyway, these are books that have shaped me as a person. A surprisingly little fantasy in there, but, it is what it is. I hope you enjoyed that. If you have questions or whatever, put them down in the comments, like, subscribe, share this, join the Patreon if you feel like it, join the channel if you feel like it. I'm just very happy that I'm still here doing this. I'm glad y'all are still following and watching these things. Thanks for doing that. And, well, let's have another year, I guess. So yeah, thanks and cheers.